Somebody asked the question earlier, and I think it's a good one. What do we do with the icky parts of history? Well, I've got a theory. I can tell you how I do it. I'm writing a book right now on the runaway scrape. But I don't start with the runaway scrape. I start with a chapter called Sinking Texas Roots. And it talks about how these Anglo-Americans ended up in Texas to begin with. Why did they come to Texas? Short answer, a little thing called the Panic of 1819. For reasons not unlike the reasons people are coming today. The economy in their home state's in the toilet. So they're coming to some place with opportunity. And you have to understand that early Texas provided more opportunity than the land of opportunity itself. And what could be more American than moving to someplace else to seek opportunity? I mean, they were 2 generations from the American Revolution. So their parents and grandparents. So the notion is, how could those people have abandoned America? It was easy, Daniel Boone, for example, died in Spanish Missouri. So people moved around a lot. But so I say, okay, here's who these people are and why. But who did they find when they got here? Well, they found Tejanos. Well, who were those people? And why did they behave like they did? Well, who did they bring with them? Well, they brought their slaves. Well, who were they? And once you introduce, I started to say kids, but once you introduce people, and your readers or your listeners or your watchers understand who these people are, that's what great writers call conflict. And if you don't have, if Ahab doesn't have a whale, that's a pretty boring story. So if you can view history's unpleasantness as the conflict in your story, and how is that conflict then resolved? What began as controversy ends as conflict resolution. And that's the way I do it, But you can't sugarcoat it, and you certainly can't Disneyfy it. And like I say, it's been my experience, and I've talked about a lot of unpleasant stuff in my work. You have to be honest with people, but you have to understand that our ancestors were they were human. That they weren't saints, they weren't devils. They were they self-concerned? You bet. But if you provide a context for understanding, people understand.
I just want to add a little bit to that. I do believe that you have to share icky history.
Yeah.
No matter how hurtful it is, you've got to share it, because once you do that, it opens up an understanding and communication. And I do believe, Michael, going back to your remark about we're so divisive right now, part of it, I feel, is that stories of all, people can't connect to the story because they don't see themselves in it. Because the story may have nothing to do with them, and that's my reason for being here today. We have to connect with everyone's story. If you don't, you have this individual way of looking at things instead of a collective way of looking at things. Regardless if the story was bad or difficult, you can still get to know each other. I truly believe in that. I truly believe you have to tell the stories.
Well, and the kids in the barrio are not going to be invested in the Texas story if they don't feel they're a part of it. My wife taught 7th grade Texas history in Victoria, Texas, a majority city. That never made any sense to me at all. Tejanos are the majority in Victoria, Texas. And Deborah would, devote a lot of the class time to talking about the Victoria story, De Leon, whatnot. Couldn't get those kids interested. Didn't want to hear it. And, she'd come up and she said, Steve, why am I more invested in their stories than they are? Don't know. But if they don't hear them, and again, they're kids. They're kids. I'm going to tell you something, and you might want to write this down. Children and young people are immature. But if they live long enough, they mature. And the stories that you told them when they were young, click in.
Talk a moment about enslaved people, because that's been a subject of my recent research in great detail. And of course, that's a difficult subject to address, but it's something that we're now going to have to address in detail because of the national holiday and because of its prominence as part of the Texas story. So how do we do that? And let me tell you, this is not an idle exercise for me, because I'm actually serving as the historical consultant for 2 separate museums in Galveston that want to put up Juneteenth exhibits, one of which wants to be the first national Juneteenth museum. The other one is kind of repurposing some of its space to tell the Juneteenth story. So Juneteenth's a very complicated thing, as you know. How would you tell that story? Not only to adults, but to children, because this is a story that children will be definitely exposed to at probably a very early age. How do you tell that story in a meaningful and appropriate way? And that's a challenge for me, because I think about to my own experience, and when I think about historic events, there were 3 things I would always go to for a historic event. 1, a book. 2, a museum. And 3rd, probably some sort of monument. Kids, even young adults, look at none of those 3 things. That's not the source of information they're getting. So we're already experimenting with this in Galveston in different ways to tell the story. Instead of having a fancy monument, instead of having a fancy museum, that's not going to happen, at least anytime soon. What has happened already is that we've covered a giant wall on the Strand with a huge, colorful, artistic mural done by an artist in Houston. And that's not the end of it. This is a Juneteenth mural by a black artist. It's very colorful, it attracts attention everywhere you go. But that's not the end of it. What they did was they arranged for it to be tied in to some artificial intelligence digital content. And so if you have a particular app on your phone, you can just hold it up against a panel in the mural, and it will start talking to you and tell you about that particular piece of the mural. And you can do that everywhere you want to along the mural. We've done what is the equivalent of the Freedom Trail in Boston. We've done that on sort of a small pilot basis in Galveston with various specific historic sites. And I narrated the one, for example, on the Custom House of 1861. But you can go to, it's marked on a map, and you can go to those locations all over Galveston, punch it on your phone, and you can hear a small sort of mini lecture or talk about that particular item. And that's not going to be the end of it. We have some people that at Texas A&M, they're envisioning a really dramatic thing. And one of the things they're looking at doing is actually putting it together to where people could go around Galveston And if they want to, they can put on a headgear and be in virtual reality so that you could go to the site of the Osterman building on the Strand and 22nd Street, put it on, and the kids could walk around the interior of the 1865 building where the Juneteenth order was signed. They could be in the room when somebody acting as Gordon Granger signs General Orders Number 3. They could hear the people talking around them about what it meant. They could see the people that were on the boats coming into Galveston. And this sort of thing, it's cutting edge, but this is coming. And so I think that this is the way stories are going to be told. This is the way the stories need to be told. And the real thing now is to figure out the technology and keep up with it. We're not going to have museums with dusty cases anymore. We're not going to have museums with big films probably and things like that. This is going to be a whole different proposition. And I tell you this about Juneteenth just because this is going to be coming and it's going to be a big thing. This will happen in some form or fashion by June of this year on a limited basis. And if the National Juneteenth Museum comes through with major funding, that will be a significant item in Galveston. But I think something similar to this will happen in other phases of Texas history, and we just need to kind of keep our eyes open for that.
I'm an immigrant. I arrived in Texas in 1976. But my first introduction to Texas was in an anthropology course when I was junior, senior in college. And it was a story about a family in Laredo. They were migrant pickers or what have you. And, 6, 7 years later, I'm in Laredo. I'm down in South Texas. It was so I came down with a kind of an open mind. But the first thing I sensed right away was kind of a little animosity between the Hispanics and the Anglos down in South Texas. And I think that still exists somewhat today. Now, it may take several generations for that to all melt away, but we also hyphenate everything. We're Mexican Americans, we're German Americans, we're Polish Americans. I mean, Texas is built up with a lot of different fabric. And I don't know how there's so many different stories. And the one person that just comes to mind is Roy Benavides. He was a war hero in Vietnam. And I think he was from Edna, Texas. El Campo, just down the road a little bit. But these kind of people that you can put up there for all cultures, all races to appreciate, admire, and look up to, I think that would help bring everybody kind of to the center stage, because we've got too many factions out there. And Lupita, I think that would be a good question to start with you, since I've got a lot of history in South Texas. And anyway, thank you.
Yes, totally agree with you. You know that I never knew about, I knew about Benavides. I grew up with a family and grandparents who loved history. So I heard all of these stories, but those stories were not in the classroom. Stories about African Americans, about Asian Americans, all of those things. The Institute of Texan Cultures in 1968 did an amazing job of having exhibits on all the diverse cultures in Texas. Along with that exhibit, they had a series of books called Texans One and All. They still have the books. They have not republished them, but you can find them in libraries. And they're a wealth of information. Since that time, we've had many, many, many more cultures who have come into Texas. I would love to say to the Texas Center, we need to fill in that gap. Maybe not through books, but through, as you say, podcasts or more exhibits. I don't know, virtual exhibits. But those are lacking, and I emphasize again that those stories will connect us. Your remark about animosity between the cultures in Laredo, I don't see it. I don't. But then again, my husband is white. And so, there's just a lot of mixtures in my family. So, but even with my friends, I don't see that animosity. I do see disparity in class. And that's where I see, the economic disparity is where I see it.
One thing I would note is that so I was not to date, so I was born in '75. So I was there to welcome you when you came. But a lot's changed. Just to be very blunt, and I certainly won't speak for San Diego or Lupita or anything, but I can tell in my own family, my father, born in '51. Grew up mostly in Laredo, and then stints in Roma and Hebronville, and then eventually in Corpus Christi. He's Mexican American. He experienced, real bigotry in his time in South Texas, and he's got some stories about it. I mean, it was nothing comparable to what like an African American of the same period would have. So it was nothing like that. But he went to a segregated elementary school, Robert E. Lee Elementary in Edinburgh. I'm sorry, did you want to?
Yeah, well, I just remember Lupita talking about her father.
Sure. Yeah. Right. With the Mexican removal policy of the early 1930s under the Hoover administration. Yeah, exactly right. But that being said, for those of like my generation, for example, so Gen Xers, which is the best generation. I'm just kidding about that. We haven't done anything. We haven't had that experience for the most part because Texas changes and Texas evolves. And if you look at Texas history and American history writ large as an aspirational fulfillment of the ideals expressed in our respective declarations of independence, both the American and Texan, I would argue that things have gotten significantly better. The disparities exist that you spoke about. South Texas, I would argue, probably has the most serious issues with class disparities of any region of Texas. But at the same time, if you want to, argue about what's it like to be a Mexican American, right now in Texas, this is probably the best time in Texas history to be Mexican American. So it changes, and to that point, because things change, because things improve. I'd argue that we as Texans ought to embrace the fact that there's many cultures and many, the kind of a diversity of not just ethnicities, but folkways and ways of life within Texas. We're a large nation. We have roughly the population of a Canada or an Australia, packed into a slightly more compact land area. But South Texas is a nation unto itself. Has very little to do with East Texas and vice versa, and that's never going to change. And I think it's something to celebrate. So.
I hear this all the time, and it's become a bit of a trope that our voices have been ignored in Texas history. And had you said that when I was a young man, I think that's probably true. I mean, if you look at let's just take, for example, T.R. Fehrenbach's Lone Star. I mean, he wrote that in 1968. Now, that doesn't seem that long ago to me, but let's do the math. That was a long time ago. And in the interim, there's been a ton of scholarship done on Tejanos, on African Americans, on women. I mean, and if you go to your grandchildren's 7th grade Texas history book, it's going to look radically different than the one you had in 7th grade. And so I really do lose patience because, like I say, people don't acknowledge the real progress that's been made. And I would just challenge you, if you think Texas historians have ignored minorities, just pick up any issue of Southwestern Historical Quarterly, the Journal of Record, pick up any textbook. You can ask me for a bibliography. I mean, the literature is out there. But friends, it's easier to complain than to read all those books.
I do want to add something, and I'm going to direct this to Don. Yes, you're right. The Texas history textbooks are chock full of information. I mean, lots and lots of information on different ethnicities. The problem is the core curriculum that the teachers have to use. That curriculum includes some of it, but not a lot of it. And the teachers, I hate to bring this discussion up, Sherry can help me with this, are teaching to the test. And so that's another huge issue. So, yes, the information is there, but it's not getting out. And by the way, there's tremendous new dynamic research that isn't included in the core curriculum. So there's that.
Well, something else that's going on, and I know this only because my wife was a middle school teacher. She would go to her principal and say, look, I want to take the kids to visit the San Antonio missions.
Yeah.
So, and the principal would say, no, Deborah, we need to, because that takes us away from studying for the STAR test. And she actually had a principal tell her this, and I quote, "Test scores are the only things that matter," end quote. Yeah.
I just want to make a couple of points. First of all, one of the things that I see in the problems that Dr. Hardin pointed out is the attitude that history is somehow a zero-sum game. That if I teach the history of this person, some other person must lose. That there's not room for more history, and that's a horrible attitude. We need to add to history. We're all Texans. Texas is a bunch of history. If some has not been worked on in the quantity that it should be worked on, work on it and add it, because it can only make it better. The idea that I'm studying this, therefore you shouldn't be able to learn that, is poisoning the well. The other thing is, and Ms. Barrera just touched on this, and I'll give you an example. There was a guy in Brazoria County named Charlie Brown, coincidentally, and Charlie Brown started life in Brazoria County as a slave, and when he died, he was one of the richest men in Brazoria County. That's a heck of a story. That happened. That happened from the 1800s to the early 1900s. If it's not being taught, that's an education problem, because that history is there. And it just depends on what you desire to teach. That's a story of someone fulfilling every American and Texan ideal that we all know and love. But is that really what some people want to talk about, success and progress? Maybe it's something they don't want to talk about, and ask yourself why that is.
I just wanted to kind of take a 10,000-foot look down at what we're trying to do here. And it strikes me, we've had a lot of conversation about the traditional ethnic groups in Texas. We're not talking about the ones that I'm seeing now in Houston, which is now, we spent many years living in Fort Bend County, Sugar Land, Missouri City area, which is the most diverse county in the entire country, and they're mostly Asians and Africans, Africans, not African Americans, Nigerians, Ugandans, many of them in the professions, mostly the more technical professions. So when we look forward, their experience is very different and very multifaceted. And it's I think a lot of them do tend to embrace, it's been my experience being Texan, but their stories need to be told too, and a lot of that can be connected because a lot of it's fleeing from oppression. A lot of it's, being different in their own home countries, and then coming to Texas and feeling that acceptance and then wanting to spread it. So I'm just throwing that out there as a challenge.
I love the question of Asian Texans, not just because my kids are Asian Texan, but it's one of the most interesting things that's happened to Texas demography in the past generation. And so I've got a lot of family in Sugar Land. I know it very well, and so you know firsthand. I think 1 in 5 residents of Sugar Land I forget if it's Sugar Land or Fort Bend County is of Chinese origin. So it's got a huge Chinese community there. Houston is a historic epicenter of the Pakistani American population as well. Has anybody seen the cricket field that's being constructed off of 290? You've seen it, yeah. It's fascinating. Do you know the story behind that? It's one of the greatest. I'm not putting you on the spot to tell the story now, but it is a great Texas story. It's a businessman. I think his name is Tanwar Ahmed, if I'm remembering it correctly. But he's from Karachi. He's a Pakistani immigrant. Came to Houston, lived the American dream, and is now extremely wealthy. Through his hard work, and is doing what he's always really wanted to do, which is build the largest cricket facility in North America. Just past the Buc-ee's. When you pass Waller and you get around to Prairie View, it's this amazing cricket facility. And what's remarkable to me is that, I'm sorry? I didn't. Oh, okay, sorry. And so what's remarkable to me, I've actually been down in Del Rio doing border work with the foundation, and the hotel proprietor was Pakistani, and he was going to play a game up there that weekend in that facility. And that's something remarkable, I think, and I'm really glad you highlighted that, ma'am, because that's something remarkable that nobody has really put the effort into studying and understanding, and I'm optimistic that the Texas Center will. What is the effect, the long-term effect of particularly these East Asian and South Asian populations, and you have to separate them out by national origin because the Vietnamese came here for one reason, the Chinese are here for another, and the Indians and Pakistanis are here for another, but they're having terrific effects on civil society, positive effects, by the by, on civil society and politics in Greater Metro Houston in particular, and also in Metro Dallas, and to a secondary extent, kind of on the north side of Austin, Texas, as well. Observationally, they seem very, I'm really going to overgeneralize here, but very eager to be Texan. It's I forget who it was that said that this like the inflows continue, but it is going to continue, and it's going to result in very different contours of the state moving forward. And I think it's terrifically exciting. So thanks for highlighting it. Don, get on this. Yeah. Quick, yeah.
So I'll wrap up with this. Great questions from the crowd. And what you're talking about is spot on. And that raising awareness, the more awareness we raise, the more we have people that are backing our play. And so it's no coincidence that the first full-time hire I made was a digital storyteller. Because everything we do, it doesn't matter if it's a phone app or if it's curriculum that's keyed to a curriculum guide, it's got to be compelling, it's got to be well told, and it's got to be digital. And so if it's the reason that we have been so determined to capture everything we can here is because it'll go back over to Building 53, and we'll cut it into usable segments that will show up on social media, that'll show up in the curriculum, that'll support some sort of lesson. And one question was kind of left hanging, about the core curriculum and things like that. One of the things that we talked about with the SBOE, the State Board of Education, was that right now the requirements in Texas are a mile wide and an inch deep. And you can't cover it all. And so you end up kind of going through a checklist. Yep, talked about that person, talked about that person. You go through it, and the kids are all going, okay, I've heard these names, but I have absolutely no idea. Bruce put it very well one day when we were confabbing at the Texas Center. He said, you know, it's like teaching kids letters, but not telling them that those letters form words and that those words form sentences. And that's the big challenge. And I tried to move Texas history to 8th grade because that's where it's tested. And I said, you know, if they were held accountable for this information, then the people that were teaching Texas history wouldn't be the people that had the least interest in being a good educator. They're the guys that won't cause much harm and may be heading towards retirement oftentimes. I mean, the old joke, of course, was, what was your Texas history teacher's first name? And the answer to that's easy. It was Coach. And so, you know, that's an attitudinal change that we couldn't get done this time. 7th grade Texas history is still going to be what it is. The good news is it's K through 4 now as well. So we'll get those kids early. So you're right in that we build a library of content, and content is king. There's not just public schools, because public schools is where the testing goes on. There's charter schools, there's home schools, there's private schools. And so we're actually building a curriculum for Texas, not just Texas public schools, but they're certainly included and welcome to it, but also everybody else that's being educated in the variety of ways. You know, and I appreciated the question about the shift towards the Asian population, especially in the greater Houston area, because it's critical for me to think about that kid whose grandparents might have evacuated Saigon on a raft and be beset upon by, you know, pirates as part of their journey. That Alamo story needs to be relevant to that Vietnamese third-generation Texan, even though they didn't have any Vietnamese guys on the inside of the walls and there weren't any Vietnamese guys laying a ladder against that wall. So it's got to speak to something larger. And so I can tell you that my attitude on the Texas Center is we're going to tell positive stories about Texas. And there's plenty of negative that we can roll around in, but what the heck is the point? You know, if we're trying to capture what it is about Texas that seems to be magical to attracting businesses, attracting people that move here, we don't lead with the bad stuff. The bad stuff's there, and bad stuff, you can find it. And those stories are also instructive. I mean, how do you know when you're truly happy if you've never really been sad? So without the bad stuff, you have no context for the good stuff, so that it certainly serves that purpose. But we're going to tell a pro-Texas story. This is not going to be a place where we try to highlight the negatives and, you know, essentially get the sharp chains and whip our backs in some sort of sorrow over past sins. You know, there's a line from Shakespeare that talks about that the good that men do. It's from the funeral oration for Caesar in Julius Caesar. The good that men do is often interred with their bones, but the evil that they do often lives after them. And we seem to be in an era where all we want to do is we want to focus on the evil things that men did, and we are ready to bury the good with their bones. And we're just not going to do it. We're going to lean forward. As I tell people, in the old days I used to be in the rearview mirror business. I was a historian. So I was in that pack with these historians that we've heard from today, Bruce and Steve especially. I'm in the windshield business now. Used to be looking behind, now I'm looking forward. So I'd heard that phrase before, and actually my wife Susan brought that up with me. And the other day I was reading an account from some folks in Kiev. And they said the problem with Russian history is that their windshield is covered with mud and all they have is a rear view. And there's so much of what is going on in the conversations across the state right now that people are just wanting to throw mud on the windshield and make everybody look through the rear view. We're just not going to do it. You know, the rear view's important. It gives you the context of what's around you. Those side mirrors, the big ones on my truck especially, tell you how close you are to the edges. But you're driving with the windshield, and that's what we're doing here. Now, I appreciate you guys making the journey in. I appreciate your willingness to consider throwing in with us. We're looking for people to help guide this story. Great intellectual lineup here. Holy smoke, I've been blown away by the brain power that's here up on this stage. I think there will probably be scorch marks in the stage after they all leave because of their auras and just the holy halos and stuff they brought in. But it's, you know, this is going to be a collective effort. The Texas Center is not so much a place as a movement. And you guys are all in. Oh, that got y'all choked up. It's not such as much a place as it is a movement. And the fact that you guys are interested in throwing in at this point and helping to build this movement right here at the ground level is important. And I appreciate y'all's participation.